Hello, Chavre, how are you? I hope everyone is gesund, stark, und freilich, begashmis und beruchnis. I hope everyone is healthy, strong, and happy physically and spiritually, and that all those that need refuah shlema should be healed immediately, and the magefa should stop now. I'd like to take this opportunity to announce that today is going to be the last lesson episode daily, because, and here comes the good news, Yeshiva Gedola of Melbourne has returned to the building this week, so I'm back to my almost normal schedule. So there are time constraints now, and therefore it would make it impossible to do this every day. In addition, obviously, the whole thing started because people asked me to give a message to my students. So in isolation, I chose to connect with my students and give a message. But now the restrictions have been eased and we can meet in person and learn in person. So in Mir Hashem Ubez Shem Yisborech, I hope to leave a message once a week, like a thought for a week, a thought for the week, in place of every day. So as usual, we'll start with a pasuk from the Rebbe's new kapitel, pasuk Kuf Gimel. Ma'anim l'tzu lechiki imrosecha midvash lefi, which means how sweet is your every word to my palate, sweeter than honey to my mouth. So here we see a clear pasuk that a person's relationship to Hashem is not only one of subservience and submission, but we should also view it as the best way to lead a life. This will bring you the best life in a revealed good way. That's what the pasuk is saying. To me, the words of Torah are sweet as honey, which means it brings me pleasure. It's enjoyable. And this brings us to this week's parsha and to today. Today is the Yartzeit of a tremendous shliach of the Rebbe, who was the main shliach in Melbourne, Australia, Rabbi Yitzchok David Groner, Dalit Tammuz. Yesterday was Gimel Tammuz, the Yemi Lula Yartzeit of the Rebbe, and therefore it's very appropriate to talk about leadership. And on a certain level, as the Rebbe explains in Chelik Beis of Likutei Sichos, the argument of Korach against Moshe is the typical argument of the layman, some congregant who thinks he's the next Bill Gates, he has a lot of money, he has a lot of cronies that are on his payroll, and he could just come along because he's so-called rich and powerful, and he'll just blow at the old man with the stick, at the rabbi, and he'll be able to blow him away. That's what it's explained in some commentaries on a certain level. So in other words, even if we take it a bit higher, that Korach is a great Talmud Chacham, also a great scholar. He comes from great lineage. But he still doesn't believe he needs a teacher. And he still doesn't believe that he has to go higher. Even though it's a bit different than what we spoke in the beginning of the week. But the Rebbe in Chelik Beis Likutei Sichos, he says an unbelievable word. He says, Korach cries, Madua Titnashaw. Favos darfen werden hecher. Why do I have to rise? Was darf man gehen hecher? Why do I have to go higher? You know the same expression in English, as soon as you think you're finished, you're finished. That was his problem. He thinks he's great. So therefore he doesn't have to become better. And when you have the rabbi or you have the Rebbe and they're always demanding more, it makes you look bad. You feel like saying, leave me alone. Why do I have to still work? Why do I have to go higher? And that's what irks some people. Because there's a certain person, a figure of spirituality, who's always going to demand more, higher, higher. Ruach ha'adam ha'eli l'mayla. That's one force. That's one power, one energy that's always striving and aspiring. And then there's another ruach, there's another spirit, ruach ha'behema yiredes lamata, which just wants to be lazy and wants to say, leave me alone. And therefore he cries out, Madua Titnashaw, enough already. Why do we have to climb higher? But one thing is missing that Korach doesn't understand. Moshe Rabbeinu, number one, is completely selfless, and it's also coming completely from Avos Yisrael. He loves you, And therefore, he is going to make you the best you can be. And that is good for you. And ultimately, even though today you might not see it, but you're going to enjoy it more. As sweet as honey. It's for your sake, and it'll be good and better in a revealed way for you. And this is what Moshe Rabbeinu was about, and this is what the Rebbe was all about. And this is what it means to be a shliach of the Rebbe, to convince, to try to influence others, to see how the way of Torah and mitzvahs is the best way to live the life. Simply, the best way. So, my favorite story of the Rebbe is a story that I heard from Rabbi Zalman Lipsker himself, who was a shliach in Philadelphia. And this is the story that he told. That it was in 1961, he was a student, and he went on Merker Shlichus. That means it was an outreach program where they traveled to cities or towns to do shlichus work, to reach out and bring out people's Jewishness in far-flung cities and places. Anyways, that night, he arrived in 770 after not having seen the Rebbe for a couple of weeks. And he decided he wants to catch a glimpse of the Rebbe. So there's the Rebbe in his room in 770. Then there's a small besmedrish where the Bochum learn on the same floor. So he heard it was a Yechidus night. The Rebbe was going to be there till late, spending time with people. So he decided he's going to go into the small besmedrish. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. And when he hears the Rebbe leaving, he'll jump up, run out of the besmedrish on the same floor, just to catch a glimpse of the Rebbe. Anyways, guess what? He put his head down on the table in the besmedrish and he fell asleep. Like 2 hours later, he feels somebody tapping his shoulder and he's already sleeping. So he goes like this. And then he feels it again. So he goes like this. And he feels it again. This time he's ready to pick up his face and tell the person, don't you see I'm sleeping? He picks up his face and he sees there standing Rabbi Chadakov, the famous Rabbi Chadakov, the personal secretary of the Rebbe. And Rabbi Chadakov asks him, do you want to do something? It's 4 o'clock in the morning. And Rabbi Chadakov is asking him, do you want to do something? He figures if Rabbi Chadakov is asking him to do something, it's coming from the Rebbe directly, really. So he says, yeah. So he gives Zalman Lipsker a pair of tefillin, and he tells him, I need you to go to Long Beach, New York, to be at this and this address at 6 a.m. precisely. Don't knock on the door a minute before, because then you'll cause them to wake up. And don't knock later, because then you're going to miss him. So I need to knock on the door of a Mr. Louis Shelder and bring this pair of tefillin to him and tell him it's from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and I'm here to help you put on the tefillin. And that's what he did. He right away left 770, took whatever transportation he had to be there at 6 a.m. precisely. And he knocks on the door, and the person opens the door. He says, are you Mr. Sheldon? He says, yes. He says, this is from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So he goes, oh, and I'm here to show you, I'm here to give you this pair of tefillin and to show you how to put on tefillin. So he says, come in, come in. They put on tefillin. He shows them how to put on tefillin. And then he tells them, where are you going? He asks the bacher, the student, and he says, Karnites. He says, okay, I'm going to Manhattan. We'll travel together a bit. And then I'll tell you what happened. He says, you know, your Rebbe is amazing. Last night, I was in Yechidus in a private audience of the Rebbe. This Mr. Shelder tells the bacher. And we were talking about my life, what time I get up in the morning, what time I go to work. And also he asked me a question, do I put on tefillin? And I told him, Rabbi, I don't own a pair of tefillin. So then the Rebbe says, but if somebody gave you a pair of tefillin, you put on tefillin? He said, but the truth is I don't even know how to put on tefillin. So then the Rebbe said, if somebody gave you a pair of tefillin and showed you how to put on tefillin, would you put on tefillin? He says, well, yes. And here you are a couple of hours later. The Rebbe strikes when the iron's hot. Meanwhile, many, many years later, and I heard this story from Rabbi Lipsker himself, there was a young girl that was running around that morning while he was putting on tefillin with this Mr. Shelder, and he gets a call many, many years later, decades later. Hello, is this Rabbi Lipsker? And Rebbe Lipsker says, yes. And a woman's voice says, you know, I was that little girl that was running around the apartment that morning when you came to put on tefillin with my father. You should know the impact of your putting on tefillin with my father was that the family became more and more observant. I grew up, I moved to Israel, I married a Ben Torah, and my children learn in yeshiva. So this story is so amazing. What do we see from this story? Number one, we see how the Rebbe will do anything to get a yid to do a mitzvah. We cannot imagine, it's unfathomable, what is the measure, the worthiness of one mitzvah. And the Rebbe repeated these lines from the Tanya many times. Vichud למעלה נצחי לעולם. That once you accomplish one mitzvah, that mitzvah stands for eternity, constantly. It creates a connection and a unification of that yid with Hashem, in a certain sense, as if it's happening constantly, every single second. So that's what's happening when you get a yid to do a mitzvah. And then it generates, goodness begets goodness. It brings more goodness to the person, to his family, to the world. What sort of goodness? A revealed goodness. So now imagine, here you have the Rebbe. It's at the end of a long night of Yechidus. It's now 3:30 in the morning. So that you have a conference. Him and Rabbi Chodakov discussed the tally, the accounting of what they did today, what has to happen. The Rebbe obviously told Chodakov, you know what, maybe you could find the Bocha now. 4 a.m. in the morning. That's asleep in the small Besmedish, and ask him to be there in a couple hours in Long Beach, New York, to be there to put on tefillin with the person. And you can understand the impact that it had on this person, that he was speaking to the Rebbe the night before, and a couple hours later the Rebbe made it his business to ensure that the tefillin would be there and he should do a mitzvah, because there's nothing greater than a mitzvah. So, first of all, the schus of the Rebbe should bring us all blessings, like he says over here in the kapitel, sweeter than honey. The blessing of mitzvahs, the blessings of leading a good life, the blessings of seeing the consequences of leading a good life. We should see all the good begashmis and in the Rebbe's schus and the schus, how he elevated the entire world. Today is also the Yartzeit, like we said, Tammuz, of Rabbi Groner, who also always did everything he could to be in contact with the entire community. It didn't make a difference who. He knew everyone's family, inside and out. He was connected to everybody, and his life 24/7 was for the community. What he could do for others and make their life better. Posting from my home in Melbourne, Be'ez Hashem Yisborach, your man in Melbourne.